Hi, I'm Daniel O'Moran. I'm a monitor. I've been monitoring for about 10 or so years, and this series is called Deck Plates Clinical Monitoring. And what it basically is things that I've learned about monitoring that basically I just want to share with other monitors, things that I've learned, experiences, perspective, and kind of lessons learned. So today is going to be on GCP 5.18. If you don't know what GCP 5.18 is in your monitor, you should really find out. This is sort of what I call the prima carta, the first document. Everything kind of starts from here. So I'm going to go over 5.18 and share some of the things that I've learned about it, and maybe you can learn a few things. The first section is 5.18.1, the purpose of clinical monitoring. So there are three purposes. One is to make sure that the rights and well-being of the subjects are protected. The second, the trial data are accurate, complete, and verifiable. And the third is that the trial is in compliance with the protocol in GCP. So, right up there, the first one is the rights and well-being of the subjects are protected. So, what does that mean for you? What rights do they have, and how can you protect them? For me, a big risk or a big right of the subject is to know what the risks are. And there are two places to find out what the risks are: the protocol and the IB. For me, the protocol is a good place to find this stuff because it's usually more succinct. There's a short section on the risks of the drug, and that's a good reference. Now the other is the IB. The IB is massive, it's very, very scientific, and for me, it's a little bit overwhelming because of the volume of information. So when I look at the IB, it's usually just one section, and that is the adverse events. And within that, there are two things that I look for. One is the most frequent adverse events that have been reported in previous studies. And the second is what grade 3, 4, and 5 adverse events have happened. So I look for that, and when I do the SIV or protocol, or IB training, I concentrate on those two sections. Usually the coordinator is not interested in the IB. The investigator is, and the investigator will understand it. But I do make sure the coordinators know about those two sections of the IB because they're important. The second is the data are, did you know that the word data is plural and you should use the word are with it? The data are accurate, complete, and verifiable. So for me, the operative word there is complete. For me as a monitor, I think one of our primary roles, a very, very, very important role, if not the most important role, is to make sure that every adverse event that is described in the source is captured in the CRF. So that means you have to read through the source, and you have to know what is significant and what is not. And I'll get a little bit more about how I do that later on. Okay, so the next section of 5.18 is 5.18.4, that I'm going to talk about, and that is monitor's responsibility. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to go back here a little bit. So I used to be CCRA certified, and I let it expire. Mostly had to do with expense, but as I'm preparing for these deck plates sessions, I'm learning a lot, and every time I go into GCP, I learn a lot. So what I'm going to consider doing is getting recertified, and then every 2 years let it expire and study for it again. Because I think going back to the basics is a great way of proceeding as a monitor. I like to swing dance. And I used to do it a lot and go to a lot of workshops. And one time I went to a workshop and the guy said, beginner dancers take beginner classes. Intermediate dancers take advanced classes. And advanced dancers take beginner classes. And I think there's something to that. It's really worth it to go back to the basics periodically because, first of all, you probably don't know them very well. And B, if you don't know them very well, you're missing a lot. In the dancing community, people who have problems with dancing typically have problems with the most fundamental part of the dance. So anyway, a little bit of a tangent. Okay, 5.18.4. Monitor's responsibilities, and I'm not going to go over them all, just the things that I have stuff to share with you. The first one is acting as the main line of communication between the sponsor and the investigator. So, I've worked for a lot of big pharmas and big CROs, and especially recently, I've noticed that there are a lot of people who have a very small sliver of responsibility. This is my dog here. Hold on a second. This is Emmett the dog, and he's down on my feet, chewing his bone and disturbing the camera. But I love him, so he deserves it. There you go. All right. So the first one is main line of communication. And what I want to say here is, because the responsibilities now have been fragmented and bifurcated into such small slivers, it's easy to not be the main line of communication. But I think you should try to be the main line of communication. Right now you've got people who deal with drug shipment, people with labs, people with data, people with regulatory, and they're all communicating with the site, trying to get what they want out of them. So obviously when you work for a company or a CRO, you have to honor the way that those organizations do it. But at a minimum, be intimate with what these different quadrants of the process are doing with your site, and try to be the main, or try to be the only line of communication. It's good to be informed. It's really good to have control. And if you let other people communicate with your site, you're losing control. Okay. Second one is verifying that the investigator has adequate qualifications and resources, and that the staff, including laboratory and equipment, are adequate to safely and properly conduct the trial. And there's another line here, adequate throughout the trial period. So a couple of things I want to say about that. Regarding lab, so there are many different pieces of equipment that are used. There's a centrifuge, there's a refrigerator, there's a freezer. Those are the big ones. So we have to make sure that those pieces of equipment are being maintained properly. In order to do that, we have to find out how they should be maintained, and then if they are being maintained by that. So the challenges of the monitor are that, first of all, a lot of sites aren't expecting us to ask for that stuff, to ask for the maintenance schedule. So you're going to have to do it, and they're going to have to provide it to you. And second of all, we're going to need documentation of whether the maintenance is being done per schedule. So this is a lesson learned that I had regarding this. I had a friend whose car caught fire in her driveway. And it melted, it burned part of her house, and it melted the siding of the person next to her. So the insurance company came to her and said, listen, before we pay for these damages, we need to know whether your car was being maintained the way that the owner's manual said it should be. So how about that? She had to provide documentation that the maintenance was being done per schedule. I don't remember what the outcome was. I have a motorcycle and I store it in my garage. So it's got gasoline, it's got electricity, there's a chance of a fire there. So I have to make sure that I maintain my motorcycle the way it's supposed to be, because if the thing does catch fire and does burn down the house, the insurance company is going to say, did you maintain your motorcycle properly? And I have to give them documentation. That's not a big deal because I do. I check my tire pressure every week. How's that? I'm a little bit OCD about some things. Alrighty, so that's that. Oh, so here's another thing. So the line says has adequate qualifications and resources, and these remain adequate throughout the trial period. So one of the things that we need to make sure is that the investigators are qualified, that they have a current license. That's the big one. And that's typically captured on the CV. So we have to make sure that we get a current, or not a current CV, an updated CV throughout the trial period. My experience has been some sites don't like to do that. They provide it once and only once. But I think the wording here is very good. We have to make sure that they're qualified throughout the trial period. So I think asking them to provide it every 2 years is reasonable. And that's my dog, again. And I love him, so he gets to do what he wants. Okay, the next line is, regarding the investigational product. The first subparagraph is, the supplies are sufficient. The supplies are sufficient. So, as a monitor, we have to make sure that the site does not run out of drug. So how do we do that? We have to make sure, find out what they have on board, and then second, how much or how frequently they'll use up drug, and make sure that the site does not run out. So that's our responsibility. So about the IP. A few years ago, one of the presidents had an advisor who used the word triangulation. That was his brand, triangulation. So that was sort of a buzzword for a while, but I kind of like it. And I actually use triangulation in a couple contexts with an IP. So for the IP, we have to make sure, compare what is shipped to what is received, and then what is received to what's in the accountability log. So that's the triangulation there. The other triangulation for IP for me is, what does the protocol say about what the subject should be dosed, what the doctor ordered, and what was administered to the subject. So that's another triangulation there. I'm big on Excel worksheets. In other sessions, deck plate sections, I'll probably talk about how I use spreadsheets, but I capture a lot of stuff. It's sort of time consuming, but it's worth it. Alrighty. Oh, so about the shipment. So most CROs and pharmas use vendors to keep track of drug. And the good thing about these vendors is that they're portals. Typically, you can generate reports, and most of the reports are very good. They're easy to read, and oddly enough, they are very applicable to monitoring. So you can run a report for what was shipped. Another report typically you can find is what's on board. You know, what they have in their inventory. So you don't have to wait until you go to the site to run those reports. You should be keeping a tracker of what the site has in their inventory. Depending on the kind of study, it should be kind of easy to figure out how frequently the stuff is being drawn down. I have a lot of oncology experience, so we don't have a lot of subjects, and the drawdown is not very frequent, so it's easy. But whatever you do not let your sites run out of drug. Let's see, moving right along. So line D in 5.18.4 is that the site is following the approved protocol and approved amendments. So here's a good one. Training, is really, really huge in our industry. So when an amendment is promulgated by the sponsor, it has to go through IRB approval. So that takes a while, maybe 2 months. In between the time that the amendment is promulgated until the time that it's approved, you can do training. And you really should do training before the amendment is approved, because once it is approved, the IRB and the sponsor expects the protocol to be enacted, followed. But until they have the training, they really should not be doing it. So my point is, do the training before the IRB approves it. Regarding monitoring visits and visits with the PI, I try not to waste time with the PI, because if I do, eventually she'll say, I don't want to see that guy anymore. He wastes my time. He asks for 15 minutes and says nothing. So I only ask for an appointment with the PI when I have something important to say. And typically that is amendments to the protocol, updates the IB, and any significant deviations. And by significant, I mean consenting problems. That's a big one. And misdosing. There are other ones, but really, you know what? Only talk about what's important and keep it brief. I'm usually in and out of there in 5 minutes. And typically I don't have problems seeing the PI because I honor their time. Respect is typically reciprocated, and so is disrespect. Alrighty, line E as in echo, verifying that written informed consent was obtained before each subject's participation. So I will do another deck plates on consenting. I have a replete checklist that I use, and I catch a lot of stuff. But regarding the subject signing consent before it, what I do is I go through the schedule of events in the protocol and find out what procedures are study specific, not standard of care. So that frequently for me has been EKG. That the EKG is required for the protocol, but it's typically not part of the standard of care. So I find out when the EKG was done, and I compare it to when the subject signed the consent form. One issue that I've noticed is that typically, or usually frequently, the consent form does not have a line for the time that the consent is signed, only the date. So I would have to ask the site to either document that no study procedures were done before the consent was signed, or I look at the time of the consenting note. Sometimes the study coordinator writes a consenting note. So anyway, I've caught a few sites on that. That's important. You know what? Sites should not be doing study procedures before consent. That's actually a pretty big deal. Okay, moving right along. 5.118.4, section F as in Foxtrot. Ensure the site receives the current IB, all documents, and supplies. Let's see. When you do an SIV, you should talk about the IB, and you should document in your report which version of the IB you discussed. And as I said earlier, when I do talk about the IB, I talk about the most frequent AEs and the grade 3, 4, and 5 AEs. Okay, 5.118.4, section I is in India. Verifying that the investigator is enrolling only eligible subjects. So, I think this is very, very important. That the site staff, and if not them, especially the monitor, create a checklist that makes it easy to identify problems. And I call this kind of checklist an active checklist. It's easy to go through a checklist, and a lot of sites just copy the protocol, and they have a little line, yes or no. You know, some of the inclusion criteria has to do with labs. You know, were the liver function tests within normal values? They just write down yes. Or here's a typical one. I work a lot of oncology. They'll say something like, it's not outside 2 times the upper limit of normal. So what I mean by an active checklist is that the checklist provide a place for the sites to write down the actual value. So let's say the LFT, and let's say that the value is AST. What is the resultant? Or what is the result of the test? And what are the limits of normal? So that way it forces the site to take action to find out what was the value and what's the normal range. What's 2 times the upper limit of normal? What's another one? Here's another one. That the subject has not received investigational product within 30 days prior to dosing or prior to consenting. So, an active checklist would be to write down when the last time the subject got an active dose, a dose of study drug. In oncology, people roll from one investigational study to another. So you have to find out that. So a passive one is saying, yep, he's okay. An active checklist would be the subject last was dosed on June 1st and the subject was consented on June 15th, so the subject is now eligible. So consider creating active checklists. And like I said earlier, I use Excel for a lot. I have actually constructed conditional formatting, which is very, very labor intensive. Depending on how much time I have, sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. I sort of default to being too thorough and it's actually sort of like pathologic perfectionism. But that's a different problem. Okay, section M as in Mike. Checking the accuracy and completeness of the CRF entries. So, this is a very important part. For me, it's one of the most important part, that I want to make sure that all of the adverse events that have occurred are captured in the CRF. And this is what I do to make sure that that happens. Almost every data management software that I've worked with, the monitors are able to run something called a listing. And a listing basically is just being able to extract one or a defined subset of the CRF and a report run. So what I do is I run listings for all of the adverse events that have happened to the subjects, all of the con meds that have happened to the subject, and the medical history. And I have those open before I look at the source. And what I do is I go through the source and I note all the con meds, and I look at the source And then I compare the ConMed to what's in the listing. And if it's not in the listing, I write a query. This should be there. So extrapolating from that, every drug should have an indication. Why are you taking this? There are different indications for different drugs, and sometimes there are multiple indications for drugs. Sometimes antidepressants are given for people who have too much saliva. One drug, like for instance, aspirin used to be given for headaches. Now it's given as an anticoagulant, 81 milligrams. So when you find out the subject is taking a drug that's not in the listing, you have to find out why. Is it a medical history or is it an adverse event? So I go through the ConMeds. Fortunately now, with electronic medical records, it's very easy to identify ConMeds. Usually there's a section. But sometimes within the investigator's notes, the investigator talks about meds. We'll put the person on this. Well, sometimes that drug is captured in the ConMed section of the note, and sometimes it's not. That's something you need to follow up on. So that's section 1 there. Within section Mike, there are 3 sections. Another subsection is any dose and or therapy modifications are well documented. So I create a monitoring tool for each subject. And my monitoring tools have a lot of stuff in it. I capture a lot of stuff. And I use this to understand what's going on in the subject, definitely not as a source that I do my CRF verification. I've worked with monitors who transcribe all of the lab values onto their own monitoring tool, and then they CRF verify that against the CRF. That is almost criminal. To me, it's misfeasance, if not malfeasance. You compare the CRF against the source, and the source is the original document, not your transcribed documents. So anyway, one of the things I do in my monitoring tool is a timeline, and my timeline typically captures dosing days, adverse events, and ConMeds. And once I get them all lined up, they're sort of easy to understand. Going back to the IB, another thing you might want to learn for the drug is what the half-life is. Look up what the half-life is. There's a medical definition, but my understanding is it's the amount of time that it takes the body to sort of metabolize half what is in the bloodstream. That's a really blue-collar definition, but it's basically how fast the drug is attenuated or is burned off. So if the half-life is 20 minutes and the adverse event is 2 weeks after dosing, it's probably not related to the drug. And you know what? In the SIV, talking about the half-life might be a good thing to do because, if it has a half-life of 20 minutes, the investigational product is probably not related to an adverse event that happened 2 weeks after dosing. So anyway, my timeline works really well. I have other timelines that I use for the study that I capture amendment dates and IB updates. It helps me keep track of what I need to teach the site staff about. Okay, section P is in Papa. Determining whether the investigator is maintaining the essential documents. So this is a tough one for me. I have been trying to figure out how to create an efficient tracker for all of the essential documents, and I haven't gotten there very far because there's a lot, and I just haven't figured out an efficient way of doing it. But There are two sections that I do keep track of that is labor intensive, but it's worth it. And that is protocol amendments and IB updates. So within that, let's say talk about the protocol. You need to make sure that the investigator has signed the protocol signature page, and that signed page is in the sponsor's files. So within my tracker, I have two lines for that: PSP signed, PSP at the sponsor. Within my tracker, I also include whether training was done, whether I trained the site, and whether that training is captured in the site's records. So those are two important things. Alrighty, and section Q, as in Quebec, communicating deviations and taking appropriate action designed to prevent recurrence. So, these are my thoughts. A few years ago, the word root cause was just rampantly overused. There was basically not a meeting that would go by that someone would say, we need to conduct a root cause to find out why this happened. To me, a root cause analysis is appropriate for really severe problems. However, we as monitors need to find out why something happened and then help the site figure out how to prevent it from recurring. So I've been doing I've been monitoring for a while, and I've come across some really bizarre stuff. Sites using the wrong edition of the consent form. Sites misdosing. Doing the math wrong. It's a busy, chaotic world out there, and mistakes happen. But except for little things like, you didn't do the one segment of a complete blood count or something relatively small like that, you should figure out why it happened at the site and sort of talk them through a solution. I have a problem using the word management when it comes to the monitor's relationship with the site. And in one way, I think we are managers because we do need to provide training, we do need to see what's going on there, and we're responsible for the outcome. But I think the site staff just hates it when they feel like they're being managed. But we as monitors are responsible for the outcome, so we have to help them. And, if you say to someone, you've got a problem and you need to address it, and this is what should have been done, they'll nod and they'll say, okay, we'll take care of that. But unless you hear something about how they're going to fix it, chances are, if it is fixed, it's just luck. So you need to talk them through it. Ask them how it happened, and then propose solutions. I had a site that one of the things on my ICF checklist is to ensure that the ICF that was signed is the most current. So I checked the consent form against the IRB documentation, and there was no documentation that consent form was ever approved. It was just bizarre. There was actually a typo on the consent form itself. And so there was no relationship between the identifiers on the consent form and the IRB approval. So I had to say to the site, how did this happen? And what are you going to do here in the future? Get them to talk about it. It's almost like taking a midterm or a final in college. The professor can say to you, hey, do you understand everything that we've talked about in the last 6 weeks? You can say, yeah, I understand that. But if the professor says, okay, write down here on the blue book, what your understanding is of what I've taught you the last 6 months. That's very different. So anyway, engage the site staff into thinking, get them to come up with a plan, and then when you go to the site next time, follow up on it. That's what you should do. So that's all I have for this. I will be doing some more of these deck plates things. But I want to say this: if you're not intimate with GCP, I can sort of understand it. Depending on how hectic your life is, you might get detached from it, and I've been there. But consider going back there for a while and looking at it. GCP is just incredibly simply written. It's organized. It's just a wonderful document. The Code of Federal Regulations is a different matter. I think that's challenging to understand and to organize. But GCP, it's wonderful. So if you're waiting for boarding, I know it sounds kind of geeky, but consider just read one section out of the GCP. It's not that much, 10 minutes. Because I'll tell you what, every time I read through GCP, I think, God, I didn't know that. So anyway, thanks for listening. Talk again soon. Emmett says, bye.